Well, welcome to this session of Paradigms of Church Planting. We've been talking about a number of different paradigms, and I'm excited today to have Brad Briscoe introduce another paradigm that's often referred to as covocational church planting. And so Brad is joining me from the Sunshine State of Florida. Brad, welcome.
Thanks, Michael. It's good to be with you, and I love having this conversation.
Yeah, well, I'm excited about where this is going to lead, and even the opportunities it might present in terms of extending our understanding of the breadth of church planting and the possibilities. Brian, you've been involved in this for a while. You've been involved in ministry for a while. Why don't you share a little bit with our students some of your background?
Yeah, sure. So, long story short, I didn't become a believer till I was almost 30 years old. And before that, I was in the restaurant business with my brother for 13 years. And it was in the midst of the restaurant business that we both became followers of Jesus, eventually sold our business and went to seminary, taught in multiple settings. I taught 8 years at a Mennonite Brethren college. Eventually, I went back and did a D-Min, and been working now for what's called the North American Mission Board for 22 years. And the vast majority of that time, I've been a church planting catalyst in Kansas City, which that just simply means I help to recruit, train, and resource and coach church planters kind of throughout the city of Kansas City. But then about 4 years ago, I took a new role, more of a national role in Canada and the United States that we just called Director of Bivocational Church Planting. So that was one of the reasons with the move. We just with this national role, it didn't really matter where we lived. And we've always been intrigued by the Gulf side of Florida. And then also there's a church here called the Tampa Underground that we really wanted to just be in a better position to kind of tell their story back into the network that I work for, because there's some things about what they do with micro churches that I just felt like our tribe or denomination needed to learn about. So been married for 27 years, have a 26-year-old, a 21-year-old, and a 12-year-old. So they're really spread out.
Wow.
Part of that is that we've done lots and lots of foster care, and a couple of those kiddos we adopted. So that's kind of the reason. Sometimes people are shocked that an old guy like me has a 12-year-old. So, but it's all good. So, and we're loving. We've been in Florida now for 2 years, and we're loving it here.
Yeah, neat. Well, I love what you have been doing in regards to covocational work, and have such a great appreciation for those in covocational ministry. We heard already from Jeff Christopherson, who helped. I think he perhaps helped you with coining the term Covo church planting. And so we're excited that we have one of the leading proponents of it with us today. Now, covocational, the idea of somebody working in a secular job and in the church, that idea isn't new. And yet you are doing this in really a fresh way. Maybe if you could, give us a little bit of the background. How did you get from what has been understood as bivocational ministry to covocational ministry?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I would say when I moved into this new role about 4 years ago that I shared earlier about Director of Bivocational Church Planting, I just knew that at least in our tribe, and I think this is true with other denominations and church planting networks really around the world, is I'm convinced there's a bit of a biased narrative around the word and the concept of bivocationalism. What I mean by that is I just think a lot of bivocational leaders, they hear these little whispers. Sometimes it's themselves, but a lot of times it's from other leaders that ask them questions like, when are you going to go to a church large enough to pay you a full-time salary? Or when's your church going to grow large enough so you can be full-time? There's just kind of this biased narrative. And unfortunately, the narrative is most of the time it's negative. And I just don't think that's helpful. I don't think it's biblical. The reality is somewhere between 50 and 70% of the leaders in our churches are bivocational. And I actually think they need to be our heroes in the church planting world. I don't want them to ever feel like it's a demotion or they're like a second class church planter. So I just knew when I moved into this role, I wanted to do everything I possibly could to begin to change that narrative. And there's probably more than this, but for me, there were kind of three ways to go at this. And let me just share what these are. And then if you want, Michael, we can come back and dig into these a little bit more. But
Sure.
I felt like the first thing we need to do is we need to highlight the benefits of being bivocational. I just think there are enormous missiological benefits and there are enormous financial benefits. And in fact, I think there are some leadership benefits as well as being bivocational. So I think one of the ways we change this narrative is if we just have to talk about, give people language and constantly talk about the benefits of being bivocational. The second thing I felt like we need to do is we need to do a better job of championing those bivocational leaders that are already out there. In other words, I just think we need to tell their story. We need to capture their stories, make them the champion, make them the hero, and tell their stories over and over and over again. And then the third thing is I felt like we needed to actually expand the language. So I just was afraid that bivocational, that word sometimes, in fact, kind of got in the way of what we want to see accomplished. Mm-hmm. And here's the way I'll kind of explain that sometimes. I'll say, think of the word bifurcate. To bifurcate means to take one thing and divide it into two parts. Well, I think, unfortunately, a lot of bivocational leaders, they do just that. They compartmentalize their mission and ministry with their vocation or their work. And I think we ought to actually try to align those things instead of trying to compartmentalize those. I think there's really a sacred secular divide going on there that we need to help blow up. Mm-hmm. That regardless of what God's called you to do in the marketplace, you're in full-time ministry, or you can be in full-time ministry. Or another way I'll say it sometimes is regardless of what God's called you to do in the marketplace, we need to help you see and understand how that calling fits into the mission of God, how that calling fits in or contributes to the mission of God. So part of it is that, so expanding the language, instead of bivocational, we started kind of playing around with this language of covocational. And here's the way I'll usually tweak or nuance that word. I'll say, think of words, well, first off, think of the word covocation. So C-O, that little prefix comes from the Latin prefix com, C-O-M, which means to have in common. Mm-hmm. So think of words like co-pilot, co-author, companion, co-laborer. It's about bringing two things into alignment. So I still use the language of both bivocational and covocational, or sometimes I'll say bivo or covo. But here's the little nuance for me. And then, like I said, we can come back and talk about any of this. But for me, a bivocational church planter is someone who has a part-time job in the marketplace that they see as temporary. So in other words, their hope or their dream or their aspiration is the church will eventually grow to the point to where they could leave their part-time job and focus full-time on the church. That's Apostle Paul, Acts 18. He was a tent maker, and I just want to say that's all good. There's nothing wrong with that. And historically, that's just the way we've thought about bivocationalism. It's a part-time job, like out of necessity, because the church couldn't pay me enough money. But I want to say, hey, there's nothing wrong with that. It's a good thing. But in addition to that, the way I think we can expand it a bit is when we think of covocational, the way I define that is I'll say covocational church planter is someone who has a job in the marketplace or a primary calling in the marketplace that they never intend to leave. In other words, they know God has called and wired them to be a school teacher or an architect or a web designer or a mechanic or a doctor, whatever it might be. And at the same time, they feel like God's calling them to start something. So I want us to help them rethink vocation and understand all work matters and say to them, look, you don't have to choose between like work in the marketplace and ministry. I want to help them see how can we align those two things together. And I want them to see the benefits of that. And the last thing I'll say is that I actually hope that the future will actually have more and more bivocational leaders, in a sense, become covocational leaders. Mm-hmm. What I mean by that is that because we talk so much about the benefits of being bivocational and we champion them to where they actually feel encouraged as a bivo leader, that even when the church grows large enough that they could leave their job and focus full-time on the church, they decide to stay because they just recognize there's too many missiological benefits and there's too many financial benefits for them to be in the marketplace. So that's just the way, very briefly, that's just how I think we can change the narrative, but it's also a little bit of how I kind of nuance both the bivo word and covocational word.
Yeah, great. Well, that was a great helpful explanation. Let's unpack a little bit these two points that you brought up in terms of the benefits, the missiological and the financial. But first, let's drill down with us a little bit on the missiological benefits. What do you see as those missiological benefits?
Yeah, I've had the opportunity over the last few years to interview dozens and dozens of Bivo Covo leaders, and I have 8 or 9 questions I ask all of them. And the very first question I always ask is, what are the top 2 benefits of being bivocational? And bar none, the number one benefit every single time, and they might frame it or use language it's a little bit different, but the number one benefit every single time has to do with access to a mission field they wouldn't have otherwise. I just think most of us are living in a rapidly increasing missionary context. So we have to find other ways to connect with people relationally. And every bivocational leader I talk to, the first thing they talk about is they have relationships with people they never, ever would have if they had to rely on them coming to a program or activity of the church.
Mm.
So I think the number one benefit is just access to a mission field. I think kind of related to that a little bit is, and I think this is a missiological benefit as well, is I just think it gives a leader enormous respectability, or you might call it street cred, both inside the church and outside the church. So I think it gives a leader great respectability inside the church because the people in the church understand that you as a leader understand what they go through Monday through Friday. And I just think sometimes when it's a fully funded, pastor, and there's nothing wrong with being a fully funded pastor or fully funded leader. I'm just saying there are times I know, we all know this, that there are people in the congregation that just feel like there's a bit of a disconnect between the leader that's fully funded by the church and the person that's working 40, 50, or 60 hours a week, Monday through Friday in the marketplace, or sometimes on the weekend. So I just think it gives great respectability inside the church. But maybe even more important than that, it gives street cred outside the church. That we all, again, are living in an increasing missionary context where being a church planter or being a pastor in a lot of settings is just a little awkward. I mean, especially if you lead with that. When someone says, "Hey, well, what do you do?" and you say, "I'm a church planter," there's a lot of areas, especially in North America, it's like, well, that's kind of weird, or what does that even mean? So I would just say, if you're covocational, if you can lead with your primary calling in the marketplace, and not to be deceptive or hide the fact that you're a pastor or a church planter also, but I just think if you can lead with what you do in the marketplace, it just opens up lots of other opportunities for conversations that you wouldn't have otherwise.
Sure, right. Yeah, and I would imagine that there is some impact even on the church itself when it is being led by somebody who is in the marketplace as well. Talk about that a little bit. What are you seeing as the impact that person is having on the people in the congregation?
Well, yeah, I just think it helps them rethink vocation. I mean, it just helps them blow up that sacred secular divide and realize. And then I think it also makes the leader more sensitive to the callings that people have in the marketplace. Mm-hmm. There's churches that do all sorts of things, and most of the time it's because the leader is in the marketplace. They'll do things in their Sunday service or in other settings to try to highlight, pray for, commission people out into their callings in the marketplace. I just think when the leader is in the marketplace, and it doesn't have to be full time. I mean, sometimes I'll talk to leaders and just say, look, go work somewhere else one day a week, just so it'll open your eyes to like kind of the real world, but then also give you opportunities you wouldn't have otherwise. But I just see over and over again, there's a deeper understanding or respectability from the people in the congregation, but I think there's a deeper understanding for the pastor or the leader when they are in the marketplace. They just have a much deeper appreciation for the work people do and an understanding about their time, their struggles, their concerns. I mean, so many of them, their concerns are work related. It has to do with the finances. It has to do with relationships at work. And I just see when there is a leader that's bivo or covocational, they're just a little more open and sensitive to some of those issues that frankly, they just aren't otherwise because they're not exposed to some of those issues.
Yeah, great. Now, what are you seeing in regards to how the church itself is being influenced by bivocationalism or covocationalism? That is, what types of, well, let me ask it this way. Is the church that the covocational planter is planting, does it look exactly like the church that I might attend down the street that has a a full-time pastor?
Well, I'd like to say no for a couple different reasons. One is kind of that third benefit I just said. I said that missiological, or we need to highlight the benefits, champion the planters, and then even around leadership some. Well, the point there is I see this happen all the time. When a leader is bivocational and especially covocational, it just changes the engagement from the congregation because they know if the primary pastor or leader of that church is working 30, 40, 50, 60 hours a week in the marketplace, you don't have to tell them that the pastor can't do it all. But I think sometimes when you have fully funded leaders, there's just this clergy laity divide. The chasm is actually expanded, and people in the congregation are like, well, wait, isn't this what we support you to do, or isn't this what we pay you to do? And I've talked to covocational church planters that I have one particular guy. It's amazing what his day job. He's actually a federal agent for the CIA. And he works, he said there's some weeks he works 60, 70, 80 hours a week. And I still remember a couple of years ago when I interviewed him, I asked him about the benefits. And the first one was access to a mission field. But the second one, he said, was that he has never had to ask for a volunteer. Like he never has to go out and say, hey, we need volunteers to do such and such. It's because everybody knows. Everybody knows this guy, he's going to be gone a lot of weekends. He's going to be gone a lot of weeks. And they just know he can't do everything. So I do think there's a bit of this activation of the priesthood of all believers out of necessity that we don't see in a lot of churches. Mm-hmm. And then the other thing, to go back to your question, Michael, I would say in the church planting realm, we just have to think about church planting differently. If you are working 40 or 50 hours a week in the marketplace, you can't plant a church the way we've always planted churches. Mm-hmm. And the way I'll usually say that, a little phrase I say all the time, is I say we need to help church planters today think less like a pastor starting a Sunday morning worship service and more like a missionary engaging a context. So in other words, we need to start with missionary behaviors and activities and let the structure or the ecclesiology, the form and function of the church, kind of organically grow around that missionary activity, rather than trying to launch, a large Sunday-centric type of gathering that is very, very resource dependent. We use lots of time and resources and energy towards that. I think if you're a covocational leader, you just have to think differently about that church planting process.
Great. Yeah, great. I love that, Brad. It sounds very much like something that has a significant application internationally on the mission field. What's your experience, or what are you hearing about covocational work around the world?
Yeah, well, the first thing I would say is sometimes when we talk about covocational, I always want to be careful not to sound like this is something new, because it's not. Other cultures, other settings, they've been doing this. In the Hispanic culture, African American culture, a lot of other, and certainly in other countries, this is the only way. This is the way we've done church planting forever. And I think we have a lot that we need to learn from these other contexts. So that's the first thing I would say. The second is that absolutely, when you're a missionary in another context, you would never, if you're going to go plant a church, you would never think, oh, I need to go find a place to rent and hire a worship leader and get a sound system. Mm-hmm. We would never think that is a first step. Instead, our first step is we need to embed or incarnate into that local context. We need to build relationships. We need to begin to make disciples. We would never think about the large gathering. Well, I think, we could all argue that even in the United States, we're closer to that setting than we are the other. I just think in most every major urban population center in the country, especially, and I work in Canada a good bit, especially in Canada, there is so few followers of Jesus that we have to start with missionary behaviors and activities. So it definitely will influence the way we think of the church and influence the way that we start a new church. Yeah. And all that, I guess, just to say, again, we have so much to learn from missionaries in other countries. And in fact, when we have a church planter here in the States, and if that church planter has international experience, I'm always so excited to have them involved, because they just have a different perspective on where to start how to make disciples, how to gather people later down the road rather than just starting with the Sunday morning worship service.
Wow. Wow. That sounds great. Well, hey, this has been fantastic, Brad. I'm so grateful for you and what you're doing, and how you are speaking into the lives of our students, and hopefully broadening our horizon on the real breadth that we see in church planting, not only in the North American context, but around the world. So thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, I just love anytime we can be an encouragement to the Bible Covo leaders that are out there. I love to take that opportunity.
Well, we're grateful for that.